Let me pause for just a few seconds before we go on with our analysis of the Discourses on Livy by Machiavelli. You probably have noticed already that one of the things I've done is spend a lot of time talking about some fairly short passages, and then I assume you have seen that I've sort of tried to also do a little bit of a highlights reel, making sure that all the major points are made in the 7 lectures that I'm devoting to the Discourses. And so what I'm going to be doing from now on, as well as in the past, is that we'll focus in on something for a while, and then I'll seem to go rather rapidly through a series of points. Right now, I'm going to begin with a series of points, and then we're going to focus on a big topic for a while, which are the extraordinary offices of the Roman Republic, offices that were only held on occasion. But let me pick up where I left off at the end of last lecture. We were talking about a corrupted and an uncorrupted people, and what some of the problems are once people become corrupted, the people as a whole become corrupted. And therefore, let me raise this point. Machiavelli looks beyond the time of the Republic to the early empire, because you at least have to ask the question, even though you have Augustus and Augustus's successors who were not son, but blood relatives, on down through Nero. When Nero died, and when that dynasty, if you will, was over, could Rome have reverted to a republic? Couldn't it have gone back to what it was before Augustus and some of his descendants took over? Machiavelli says no, because by then the people were so corrupted that it was not possible to have a republic again. And so it is important to say that although one can note corruption and make some adjustments to it, corruption of the people as a whole, moral corruption, controlling them from the government in such a way that they can't speak out, keeping them from being able to introduce legislation so they feel they have no stake in government. Once those elements have occurred, it's very hard to go back. But I do want to suggest one corrective that Machiavelli offers. If people are corrupted and you're trying to preserve or hang on to, even by a thread, a republic, one of the things you might do is shift your constitution with a stronger monarchical element. In other words, what he's saying is, if you've got a less than ideal situation for a republic, what you might need is not a constitution exactly like the early Roman constitution was, but one with a stronger element. Remember the 3 elements of a republic: monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. A stronger element of monarchy. We might today, in our Constitution, after all, say, maybe then we would need a stronger president than we would if the nation were uncorrupted. I simply use that as an analogy. I'm not making a claim that way. But Machiavelli does therefore say you can somewhat change the constitutional arrangements, and you can do that based on what the needs are and what your observation is of what it is and is not possible in a particular society at a particular time. And that larger point, I think, is an important one. Machiavelli takes up the question of how do you deal with leaders in a republic who make mistakes? After all, lots of leaders make mistakes. Machiavelli says 2 things. If a commander, we're thinking now primarily of military mistakes, if a commander errs from malice, just makes a mistake in a sense out of, he's angry with somebody, he's jealous of somebody or whatever, the person needs to be punished, but humanely. One of the reasons Machiavelli says that will make sense after we look at the second piece of what he says. A commander who makes a mistake out of ignorance should be honored. It's a very interesting claim. That if somebody makes a mistake out of malice, punish them humanely. If they make a mistake out of ignorance, just a mistake, there's a fact that they didn't know to put into the calculation of where they moved their troops or whatever, that person ought to be rewarded. Let's talk about why Machiavelli would make those claims. Number 1, if a leader makes a mistake, even if it's from malice, and you punish him inhumanely, who's going to be stepping forward and saying, I think I'd like to be a leader? You might keep certain people out of the leadership, people who withdraw into a more private sphere because they say, well, I'm willing to be criticized. I'm not willing to be humiliated. I'm willing to be punished. I'm not willing to be chopped into little bits, or whatever it might be. The second point he makes is you need to honor those who make what we might call today honest mistakes, because otherwise commanders will feel there's such a rigid structure set upon them that they will not use their minds creatively and freely. They'll be afraid, we would say today perhaps, to think outside the box. You have to let the leaders know if you fail because of something that just simply wasn't in your calculation, it's okay. You're not going to be castigated in the society for that, because if you castigate people for that, you will take away creativity. And we've talked about the fact that Machiavelli always emphasizes the need to think creatively. The whole point of studying history is to use it creatively, not simply to copy it, and not simply to use it for entertainment. And so our leaders have to be encouraged to be creative and thoughtful, to think outside the box, to try new solutions to problems. And we need the best people in leadership, the people that have those creative minds. And so it's sort of interesting to see how Machiavelli deals with that problem. One more issue I want to take up briefly, and that is, we would expect Machiavelli to say, and in The Prince he seems to say this directly, if you find a problem, root it out and deal with it right away. Remember the medical analogy he made? That a disease in its beginning is hard to diagnose but easy to cure? But Machiavelli says, let's refine that a little bit. There are some problems that you want to put off dealing with. And you need to know which kinds of problems are which. He said, if something at the moment is scaring people, people think they have something to fear right immediately, you probably want to sort of let that sit for a while. And interestingly enough, here he gives an example, and the example is from his own time period, that is, say, Renaissance Florence, and his example is a negative example. It's a time when Florence should not have dealt with the problem, and did. The problem occurred in 1433, and the problem was that there were a lot of people who feared that Cosimo de' Medici was getting, we would say today, a little bit too big for his britches. He had not yet gotten power, but nevertheless, he was very powerful, and there were those who feared Cosimo de' Medici. And so in responding to that fear, Cosimo was exiled. He was kicked out of Florence. What did that do? It did exactly the opposite of what the people who kicked him out wanted to do. It made him, we would say today, something of a martyr in the eyes of many of the Florentines. They felt he had been wronged. It raised up the Medici supporters, made them that much stronger. Cosimo came back to Florence the very next year and did take over in ways he probably couldn't have if he hadn't been exiled. The exile, in a sense, made it easier for him to grab power, not harder. And so when you see problems, I always think of my former Senator Patrick Moynihan, before he was a senator, talking about in the Nixon administration with regard to certain issues, sometimes you need to use what he called benign neglect. And that's sort of what Machiavelli is talking about here. There are times when you've got to see a problem and nip it in the bud. You get it right away. You go right after it, because otherwise it will be a growing cancer. And there are other times when you say, we're just going to let this one sit a while, because to act now will make it worse rather than better. And we get, therefore, in The Prince, you can say, in The Prince we had sort of, a lot of important pronouncements to a strong man. Here we get sometimes more subtle and more nuanced analysis. Things that sounded like almost absolute rules in The Prince turn out to be not quite so absolute, because one of the things we know is Machiavelli is for adjusting to the situation. This is a place where he ponders this perhaps a little more carefully, a little more thoughtfully than he did in The Prince. Again, a work written quite quickly after he went into a kind of voluntary exile in 1513, and therefore in some ways not as considered a work as the Discourses. Now, big topic. One of the qualities of ancient Rome, you learn this when you take your Roman history, is that the ancient Roman Republic had certain offices that were only filled on occasion. They were not always offices. They were offices that were only filled to meet a specific need. And the most famous of those offices was the office of dictator. Now, get rid of all the modern notions of what that word dictator means. A dictator was an official of Rome who was given a kind of special authority for a very limited time when the regular process of government wasn't working. Let's take the obvious situation. Okay? You have two consuls. Remember, the monarchical part of the Roman Republic is not one person but two. So you've got two consuls, and they're equal. Well, you have to ask the question, what happens if one says what we need to do is charge and the other says what we need to do is retreat? You can't take a vote because the vote's 1-1. Now, obviously, hopefully, they can work out some sort of arrangement, some sort of plan, some sort of action. But the very fact that you've got two consuls to sort of guard that the power of the monarchical part of the republic doesn't get out of hand causes its own problems. And when those problems become severe, a dictator will be selected for a brief period of time to sort of take action when otherwise Rome might suffer from inaction, or to take decisive action when compromised action isn't really sufficient. Machiavelli has some interesting things to say about the office of dictator. First of all, he says the office was often beneficial to the Roman Republic. During the Second Punic War, you had two consuls that went at it over how to deal with Hannibal, and the great dictator Fabius was chosen, and Fabius sort of laid out the tactic in the long run of how to defeat Hannibal, who had been clobbering Roman armies in pitched battles. And so he's the great example of a Roman dictator. However, Machiavelli said, the office became dangerous when it was abused. For example, what happens when a dictator says, well, okay, my term's up, but I haven't really gotten things done yet. Let me have the office a little bit longer. That was a danger. And in fact, by the end of the Republic, people were asking and being granted the office of dictator for life. Julius Caesar was a dictator for life. When the office came to be used that way, it was detrimental to the Republic. Here's the issue, Machiavelli says. Republics move slowly by definition because you've got elements of monarchy, elements of aristocracy, and elements of democracy. And there are going to be debates and discussions and disagreements. And therefore, there are times when you can't wait for the government to move slowly. There are times when action has to be taken immediately. And that is why the office of dictator was created. It was needed as kind of a safety valve because of what we might call the checks and balances of a republican form of government. But once again, there are some dangers. Let me suggest one by reading a passage from the first discourse of Machiavelli. Although extraordinary measures may be beneficial at a certain moment, the example nevertheless causes harm, because if one establishes the habit of breaking the laws for good reasons, later on, under the same pretext, one can break them for bad reasons. You really need an uncorrupted people to have an office like dictator, because the dictator is, in a sense, allowed to break some of the laws and customs that the consuls have to abide by. There are fewer checks on the dictator for his term of office than there are on the consuls. And therefore, essentially what you do is say, it's okay for this guy at this moment to break the law. If you have a corrupted people, or if you have corrupt people achieving office, they're going to come along and say, let me break the law. After all, we've always said it's okay to break the law under some circumstances. I'm saying these are the circumstances. I am the guy. Let me break the law. So here is an office that is very useful and very dangerous. Interesting. Here's a second example of the same phenomenon. Early in the Republic, there was a time when the Romans needed to sit down and hammer out some statutes, some laws, some written text. And so there was an agreement to suspend all the traditional offices for a year and elect 10 men. The word we pronounce in different ways. I'm a medievalist, so I tend to pronounce Latin in a medieval way. It's decemvir. Okay? 10 men is what we call them, the decemvirs, or I call them virs because, again, I do medieval Latin rather than classical Latin. The classicists are now shivering wherever they may be hearing or watching this. But at any rate, this is a group that produced the famous body of Roman law called the 10 Tables. This was, again, Machiavelli says, a good idea. Exceptional circumstances, you have an exceptional response. The traditional institutions weren't doing it. And so something extraordinary is created. Here's the problem. At the end of the year they were given, a lot of people said, you know, their work's not done. Let's give them another year. And in that second year, they began to hold on to their office by acts of violence and were ultimately forced to relinquish their office and go back to the regular structure of the Roman Republic. This is dangerous, to set aside the traditional offices for a while and say, extraordinary circumstance, extraordinary solution. Now, there are many ways that Machiavelli admires this because it gets things done, because almost by definition, it's hard to get things done in a republic. If you don't think so, look at ours. We have a president with veto power, we have 2 houses of our legislature, and we have a federal court system. And we all know, any day you turn on the news, any day you turn on C-SPAN, we know that it's a fairly messy process to get anything done. And members of Congress moan about the president moans about members of Congress, and the Senate moans about the House, and the House moans about the Senate, and everybody moans about the Supreme Court. So we understand that. And so Machiavelli says in Rome, they had ways of getting around these problems. Now, by the way, when our constitutional founders looked at the Roman Republic as a model, they said, we don't want those offices. Now, certainly there are some safety valves in our states and in our federal government. In my state, for example, there's a way to call a constitutional convention without the state legislature or the governor being involved. So there are ways in which there are designs to try to provide extraordinary solutions in extraordinary times. But generally speaking, our founding fathers were not as comfortable with these ideas as Machiavelli was, at least when Rome originated them, because again, at that time, he says, the Roman citizens were pure. So this is interesting. Now, Machiavelli says, let's compare those ways the Romans did this, at least in the beginning, effectively, with the way the Florentines have done some of these things. Now, in Florence, he says, we have a tradition of having extraordinary officers. In particular, in the 12th and 13th centuries, there were officers created in almost all the Italian city-states, one called the podestà, who's a kind of guy that took over the judicial functioning for a while, 6 months or a year, and later on, in a similar way, a guy called the captain of the people. But Machiavelli says the difference is, in these city-states, including Florence, these were foreigners who were brought in for a while. The Romans entrusted their own citizens with these special tasks, while the Florentines didn't trust any of their own citizens because of the bitter factionalism, and therefore thought that bringing in foreigners was a good idea. Machiavelli is very clear that he did not think much of that Florentine solution to the problem as it was addressed by Florentine and other cities' officials in the 12th and 13th century. For those of you who have been to Florence, just to remind you of this institution and its power, the palazzo, the building where the podestà lived, and by the way, when the podestà left, he put up his coat of arms, so you'd know that he'd been the podestà, is now the museum in Florence called the Bargello, this big castle-looking building only a couple blocks from the main square of Florence. And those of you who have been to the Bargello and seen the courtyard with all the coats of arms in it can remember those are all non-Florentine coats of arms. They're all the coats of arms of foreigners who came in temporarily to sort of take over the administration of parts of the government of Florence. Machiavelli didn't think that was a very good solution. If you've got a populace like ancient Rome had for a while, then offices like dictator are good things. you're better off to entrust these extraordinary tasks to your own citizens. Now, Machiavelli looks at another important event in Roman history, and that's an event involving two brothers named Tiberius and Gaius Gracchus. They are sometimes referred to together as the Gracchi, simply plural of their name Gracchus. And in the second half of the 2nd century BC, the dates we associate with them are usually 133 and 121 BC or BCE, they tried to bring about a reform through what were called the agrarian laws. And these are extraordinarily important laws, and the whole process of what the Gracchi did, the fact they were both essentially murdered, and the results of the controversy that they caused are an important lesson that Machiavelli wants to teach us. The basic issue was land had come more and more by this time into the hands of fewer people. Fewer people had bigger estates. And that was not the way the agrarian system worked in the early republic. And the Gracchi said, let's go back to the way it was. And the way we do that is by limiting the amount of land any Roman can own. That was the basis of the agrarian laws. And it didn't just apply to new lands that were conquered. It also was to be done retroactively. In other words, it would break up the estates of these large landowners, the Roman aristocracy, the very folks whose senior members of the family became senators, in fact. This struggle over the agrarian laws brought about hatred between the common people and the aristocracy, because the aristocracy would lose land, and of course the common people are the one who would gain land. And therefore, although Machiavelli has said discord and controversy can be a positive thing in republics. That's how the Republic of Rome became a full-fledged republic, after all, as we saw. Nevertheless, in this case, it worked to the detriment of the Roman Republic because it created this serious hatred between the common people and the aristocracy. And so, what happened? What happened after the agrarian laws failed? The common people found a leader, somebody who would champion their cause against the Senate. And that was Marius, who, by the way, was elected consul, and then elected consul again, and then elected consul again. It wasn't supposed to work that way. Well, you know what happens. If, in fact, the common people have a champion in Marius, needless to say, the aristocracy finds their champion. And that was Sulla. And a kind of civil war that developed between Sulla and Marius leads directly to the collapse of the Republic. That's what happened to the Republic. The next generation of Marius versus Sulla is Julius Caesar versus Pompey. And so this division became so bitter. It's very hard not to have this kind of bitterness, not because of the law, if it simply pointed forward and said, from this time on, any new land Rome conquered is going to be divided up in certain ways. It's because they said we're going to take away land, we're going to confiscate property from those who have lots and distribute it in smaller units to those who don't have any. And that hatred and bitterness and division among, after all, not just the people and the Senate, but therefore a clash between the tribunes, who were the chief officers of the people, and the Senate, which was, after all, made up of the aristocracy, that led to the collapse of the Roman Republic, perhaps more directly than anything else. So we need to appreciate what Machiavelli says here about enacting laws. Notice that in our own Constitution, we also have prohibition about ex post facto laws and so on. That Machiavelli makes a very important point about this particular moment in Roman history being detrimental to the survival of the Republic and free institutions and an ordered people. Machiavelli stops some of the specific discussion of Roman history at one point and says, let's talk about history a little bit. Let's step back, as he does from time to time, and talk about the historical process. And Machiavelli wants to ask the question, does history repeat itself? Well, let me read to you what Machiavelli has to say. This is, in case you want to follow along in the book, still in Discourse 1. This is chapter 39. The discourses are divided into small chapters. Let me read this. Anyone who studies current and ancient affairs will easily recognize that the same desires and humors exist and have always existed in all cities and among all peoples. Thus, it is an easy matter for anyone who examines past events carefully to foresee future events in every republic and to apply the remedies that the ancients employed, or, if old remedies cannot be found, to think of new ones based upon the similarity of circumstances. But since these considerations are ignored or misunderstood by those who read, or they are understood but are not recognized by those who govern, it always follows that the same conflicts arise in every era. He seems to be arguing for a kind of cyclical view of history. We've all, I think, had that feeling, if we know any history at all, of reading the paper one day and saying, here we go again. Been there, done that. And the older we get, the more we tend to say this. Oh, guys, this is just like, fill in the blank. Whether it's an editorial in the newspaper that says we're going the way of the fall of the Roman Empire, or whether it's somebody that says, oh, here we go, the same problems that did administration X in is going to do administration Y in a more contemporary way. Well, Machiavelli wants to think about this. There are certain similarities, certain kinds of circumstances that recur. Not an original idea in Machiavelli. We find that in Thucydides 2,000 years earlier. Because there are similarities, we need to know the past. What better guide do we have than knowing how similar situations have turned out and what's made them turn out the way they turned out? But what I want to argue is that Machiavelli does something interesting with this argument. What he basically says is ignorance of the past leads us to go around and around. We come to the same situations, we make the same mistakes, we get the same results, and here we go again and again and again. No, Machiavelli says, it doesn't have to be that way. The proper and careful study of history is liberating because we see what has worked and we see what has failed, and we don't need to have the same results as happened the last time there was a parallel situation. That the only way to liberate ourselves from the cyclical past and having a cyclical present and a cyclical future is to understand that cyclical past, to see what worked and what didn't work, how we can take some of the advice and apply it, how we have to adapt some of the advice because circumstances may be parallel but they're not exact. And therefore, as Machiavelli does, by the way, in all of his books, he does this in the Florentine Histories with some of Machiavelli's particular interpretations. I think probably most of us will agree that he is somebody who's right on with regard to understanding why we need to take the past seriously and how we need to use it creatively. It's a theme that I've presented in several different ways. There'll be more of this, but I want you to see the different ways in which he talks about this, the different angles that he comes at this from. He can't imagine any society functioning very well, breaking out of old habits, changing the results and failures that have had in the past and when in similar situations in the present, unless you're really serious about history. It's not just knowing some stories. It's not being entertained by the past. It's really understanding, thinking historically. It is not a sort of secondary piece of knowledge. It is essential for everyone to have it. I want to turn to one more topic quickly in this lecture, and that is Machiavelli says leaders should not disobey laws. We're not talking about the dictators now. We're talking about the regular offices. They should not disobey laws, and they especially should not disobey laws that they themselves established. And Machiavelli gives two examples, one ancient, one modern. The ancient one is a Roman named Appius Claudius. He denied, when in office, somebody an appeal, and then later on, when he was prosecuted, he demanded an appeal. He demanded something he wouldn't give somebody else. That doesn't work. That's a very bad thing to do. He's a bad example. The other example is Savonarola, because he said Savonarola encouraged guaranteeing the right of appeal in Florence. Some of Savonarola's followers refused to go along with that. And when Savonarola did not condemn those followers for not doing what he had advised, Savonarola's reputation fell. Savonarola became complicit in that activity. Interesting point.